Hello! Welcome to Free Will, Science, and Religion. I'm Chandler Klebs, and today I'm here with George Ortega, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the which is important, happiness or truth. In certain examples, like is it good to tell white lies if it makes people happy? Like, at what level do we be honest, even at the cost of our happiness, or do we sometimes accept lies in order to make ourselves or others feel better, or even to save lives? Like, do the ends justify the means? And I think this plays into whether or not people believe certain types of lies are moral or immoral. And I've been having this question lately. And so, George, I know that you've talked about happiness is what it's all about, that everything we do is really based on pleasure and pain. We seek pleasure and avoid pain. But it would seem that some of us, like me, have a tendency to be compulsively honest. Another example of no free will, where we just have to tell the truth even when it's inconvenient. So, how do we explain this?
All right, so like relative to our theme of free will and telling the world something that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. They don't want to hear, they don't want to accept, and it kind of like threatens, who they believe they are, what they believe about the world. And so like, essentially I do it to help create a happier world. Now, if I thought that it wouldn't create a happier world, I don't think I would do it. And here's my reasoning. Um, Aristotle referred to happiness as the highest good, and also like the only end in life. Everything else being a means to happiness. And so, from that perspective, you have truth, you have all these other virtues and values and aspects of life. But I don't think there is as high a good as happiness. In other words, happiness is a good. Sometimes there's competing virtues, and I think in a certain sense, it makes sense to go with happiness, sometimes at the expense of truth. I mean, naturally, we're not doing that with the free will thing, but interestingly, people who are unable to accept our message, that's what they do. They kind of like, until we can convince them that they will be as happy as they were before, and the world will be happier, then they're going to resist our knowledge. But I guess it's kind of like the guiding principle that I use is like the greater of two goods or the lesser of two evils. And I guess, yeah, my perspective generally is that our reality is always in the service of happiness, and truth is a tool, to create that happiness. So while it's, I think, wise to rely on truth as a very reliable tool, that generally honesty is the best policy, and it does help us to create a better world in general. I think there are certain exceptions.
Yeah, I think that a truth is a valuable tool at creating happiness most of the time. And there are often times when a truth is inconvenient and we may refrain from saying anything at all about something. Or if someone asks us, we can tell them that we don't want to answer the question, which is, of course, the truth. If we don't want to talk about it. So I think that's one way of dealing with it. But I also agree with your larger point that as far as our free will message goes, we're doing it because we believe it will make a happier world, as people lose this whole idea of blaming themselves and others and seeking revenge and all this punishment that flows from believing that people are the true source of the immoral things they do.
Exactly. So yeah, so the question becomes, I mean, like in our, so like with free will, it's not really a challenge for us. We truly believe that the world will be better this way. And so like yeah, then it just leaves other kinds of, like for example, sometimes like with the religious people, they tell kids about like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and all, and like in a sense they're lying to kids. And this is where it becomes a bit more complicated, because on the one hand, yeah, it's like, it it creates a kind of like a fantasy world that kids enjoy and all. But I'm actually, I kind of like think that maybe 200-300 years from now, they might conclude that no, this kind of like deceiving kids into believing in magical things and all, I think that would, ultimately explain some of like some people actually becoming psychotic later in life, actually becoming delusional based on these like early powerful lies that they've been told before their reasoning capacities are able to deal with them. So I think that sometimes the lies we tell ourselves and our kids and all just are for whatever temporary good they may do. I think that they may actually create more harm.
Yeah, and specifically with the example of Santa Claus, because that's so common in America, I've seen that kind of thing. I think my current position on that matter is that it always leads to something bad when parents lie to their kids about Santa Claus. And that is either because that child believes it for a long time and it allows their mind to believe the unbelievable and things that are logically impossible, which can be bad for their whole mental health later in life, or that child has the intelligence to realize that the whole Santa story doesn't make any sense and they quit believing it, but then they're mad at their parents for lying to them. So I think those are the two common situations that result from it. And I don't think either of those actually lead to happiness anyway.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of people who believe, like for example, free will is a belief that's not based on reason. It's kind of like based on magical thinking, on just the desire to have this free will, just like, similar to Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and things like that. Yeah, it's a nice thing to believe in, so people just, adopt the attitude, oh yeah, anything's possible, but no, anything, not everything's possible. And so it does, it leads not just to kind of like people, resorting to magical thinking as adults, and just kind of like, even like with the climate change thing. I mean, people refuse to accept the evidence because their worldview, their view of reality doesn't conform to it. They can't, accept that something so threatening could be happening to us. And yeah, I think these beliefs that these fantasies that fairy tales. I mean, sometimes when kids are told fairy tales, sometimes they're told that it's not true. They're told it's a story, and that make believe can be fun. Like plays and stories that people write and all. But naturally, when that's done, it should be done with the truth that yeah, this is not real. It's just like for fun, for pretend. But unfortunately, like we were saying before with the Santa Claus lie and some others, yeah, it's it really, I think, affects kids in a way that they're not able to act on rationally. They're not sophisticated enough to, and it does lead to, I think, a lot of problems in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking of the climate change thing, that's a great example of how people believe that climate change is just a lie that the scientists invented. People teach that, in fact. They teach that to their kids and stuff, here's the deal. It's easy to see why they would want to believe that there's no climate change because obviously that has implications that of realizing, that how humans are destroying the planet with things they're doing, and it also means that one of the things with climate change that depresses me, George, is while trying to hope that everyone changes and the worst effects will be prevented. Looking at the way things are and how resistant people are to changing their ways, I think we're going to see the worst of it. I really don't think we're able to stop it. And it's an inconvenient truth, not a happy thought. And so I have to admit that sometimes I wish I could go into denial about climate change, but I can't.
Yeah, and like, I mean, while I tend to kind of like feel similarly, I mean, I also hold out hope for the unexpected. For example, like in 2007, or 2000, early 2008, the presidential campaign. Nobody would have dreamed that a black man named Obama, Barack Obama, would defeat Hillary and become the president and defeat the Republicans. But that happened, and now Sanders may actually be defeating Hillary again. So like, you know, it could be that sometimes goodness does win out. Maybe that's a kind of like an unwritten spiritual law that we go through problems. We went through the two world wars and the Civil War and all. It's not like everything's perfect, but that over time, like we've gotten rid of, for the most part, slavery, and then we're just like evolving. And so yeah, so hopefully with climate change, there will be some kind of an answer. And yeah, it may maybe not, who knows, but the important thing is that whatever happens, that we'd be able to kind of like manage it, and maintain our happiness, just because that's really what it's about to a great extent. But getting back to the truth and lies, for example, there's some instances, like for example, let's say there are some evil people that are looking for a good person to capture or kill or hurt or something, right? And let's say they ask us if we know where this person is, and we do, but we want to protect this person. So this is an example. Like in my case, I wouldn't have any hesitation at all. I would lie to the as much as possible to protect this person. So see, this is one example of a case where actually more good can be done through deceiving, a person whose intent is to do evil, than to actually, tell the truth and then like have a lot of harm come about because of that.
Yeah, and I completely understand that viewpoint. In fact, I actually have no like it I mean, even though I'm committed to honesty, I can fully understand why someone would lie about the location of someone, for example, to save their life. I can see that, and yet what's very interesting about it is that for me, what would happen if they asked me is I would probably tell them that I'm not going to give them any information, which probably results in them just killing me. But at least I feel like I die with integrity or something like that. Like I feel like at least I wasn't pressured into lying before I was killed anyway, because I'm going to die anyway, you know?
Yeah, no, and a lot of people with religious convictions have died for their beliefs. With the Inquisition and the Crusades, people are, forced to say things that they don't believe, and that have chosen to die rather than to do that. I think Galileo was killed, or I'm not sure whether he was imprisoned, life in prison or something. One of these guys, Bruni, I think, um, was killed for his belief about, like, the sun um, not revolving around the earth, or whatever. But so I mean that's an interesting point. Um, Again, I would like, because then you have two values. In other words, like truth is a value and happiness is a value. Life is a value. Self-preservation is a value. So then the question becomes: is truth a greater value than happiness and life preservation? Because like while we're fulfilling one virtue, we might actually be sacrificing another. And I guess in my case, I would hold the value of life as more important than truth. In Judaism, when I was Orthodox Jewish, there was kind of like a law, that basically advised that, like, when somebody's life is in danger, the Jewish law in that case is that you're actually expected to break any law that you need to, any other law, in order to save the person's life. So that's how, great a value was placed on human life. So again, so sometimes I'm not sure, you know, it, I would think that truth is supposed to be serving us, and it actually might be a higher dignity to be in the service of life and happiness than in the service of truth.
Yeah, it's interesting, George, because as you know, I've called myself pro-life for many years, and I apply that to not just the unborn, but all life as much as possible, even to a certain extent, respect for plant life. And here's what's interesting about it, George, is that what's made me reconsider this whole issue about life versus truth recently is it has a lot to do with the idea that some people find the lack of free will so depressing that they would kill themselves over their life being meaningless. And my problem is that having considered it, I realize that I do not support the idea of delusions, whether it's believing in free will or creationism or believing in or promoting the idea of an afterlife. Even if I don't believe it's a true thing, I will not lie and tell somebody that, even if that is what kept them from committing suicide. You know what I'm saying? Because I just feel like as soon as I open the floodgate of lying, it's almost like by doing such a thing, I would throw away my entire value system.
Well, all right, let's compare that, for example, to self-defense. Like, ordinarily we have a value that I think is as important as truth, to not hurt others, to not, afflict or and inflict people with pain and suffering. But, let's say you're in a situation where somebody's, physically attacking you. Now, generally, we have this understanding that in cases like that, it's actually the right thing to defend ourselves. It's physical self-defense, and it would actually be wrong to kind of like allow ourselves to be hurt, by someone. So, like, what I'm pointing to here is a context where it's like in most situations, in almost every situation, it's wrong to hurt another person. But if a person's trying to hurt one, then all of a sudden it becomes right to hurt that person, if it's necessary. So while, and so so relative to truth, it seems that, like, yes, truth as a guiding principle seems extremely wise. It seems like, the more truthful we are in general, the happier everyone will be and the better the world will be. But just like with the issue of self-defense and violence and, afflicting someone, where there are kind of like contextual exceptions, there would seem to be the same. For example, like so you know you tell somebody the truth, that and then they commit suicide, and that creates a lot of suffering. Whereas, like, I wouldn't see the value of, because again, like, I guess my perspective is that truth and these other qualities we don't value them in a vacuum. We don't value them of themselves. We value, like you said, because, like, you're afraid that if you tell one truth, it's going to kind of like open the floodgates for a lot of, or one falsehood rather, it's going to open the floodgates to a lot more falsehoods, which will be harmful, right? So your basic concern does seem to be harm. You want to avoid harm. Now, I think in your position, what may not be consistent or completely accurate is the belief that, like, by by telling one lie, that will open the floodgates. For example, like if somebody's attacking another person and that person chooses to defend themselves, I don't think that they would fear that after that act, they're going to go around like attacking other people, in the case it's not self-defense. So,
Right. Yeah, it's I get what you're saying there. Although I think particularly what's interesting is, like for example, if I lie and tell somebody whatever it may be, that if like for example, to tell somebody that they have free will because them believing that they have control over their life in is what they require to have meaning and purpose of their life to make their life worth living. I feel like that lie would be an example of one that's so dangerous. And I guess that is partly because free will is such a harmful belief that to at any time promote such a false belief is is very harmful. And perhaps it can be said that some lies are more or less harmful than other lies too.
yeah, and then getting back to like the free will illusionists, I mean, like Saul Smolansky, he understands that free will is an illusion, but he seriously, for some reason, believes that the illusion is preferable to the truth. So a lot of times it's just like, the challenge is to have the proper determination of this equation, this like, cost benefit analysis of what's going to happen, depending on whether the truth is told or not. And I guess, again, like I think we can have confidence, strong confidence that in general, the truth is the best guiding principle.
Yeah. I think what's interesting here, George, is that like the whole free will illusionist stance, like, well, yeah, I know we don't really have free will, but don't tell anyone that because it'll lead to immoral behavior or something. I think the problem with that is once someone does that and says, well, let's live in illusion and let's live in fantasy rather than what the evidence shows us or what logic dictates, they've completely given up the scientific method. They've completely given up a career based on finding the truth. And I suppose I don't know, and I don't know, this might just be a personal thing with me, but for some reason, there's something for me about the integrity of being a person who values truth, a truth seeker. And perhaps in the end, it's because I do derive greater happiness from being based in the truth.
Right, but again, like you might want to question your fundamental motivation. In other words, I think you value truth as much as you do because you anticipate that that's generally the wisest course for the world. So in essence, it seems like you're really valuing your top value does seem to be, a better world, a happier world, and truth is in service to that. So in terms of like dignity, again, sometimes we're forced with like choosing between the lesser of two evils or the greater of two goods. And I'm not sure you'd have to kind of like, for example, like if somebody was, I value life and I value happiness, and I know that like, that let's say someone were to threaten me like you either recant your refutation of free will or I'm going to kill you or something, right? I mean, I would probably recant it. I would probably say, yeah, all right, you're right. Yeah, there's, free will does exist and all. And I'd live and whatever. And so, like, I've told this person a lie, but I'm comfortable with it because, like, first of all, it's kind of like I'm battling an evil. If somebody's like, threatening to kill me for a belief, I feel kind of like justified to kind of like to use like an evil against an evil in a sense. I know it's not sometimes the ideal thing, but it just doesn't seem right for me to lose my life over an ideal when the purpose of ideals and values are to serve life or to serve happiness.
Well, yeah, I get exactly what you're saying. And here's the deal. It's not just that I don't blame you, because of course I can't blame you anyway. You don't have a free will. But it's also that I understand the viewpoint. It's also that I wouldn't blame you even if I was a free will believer, just because of the fact that I understand that somebody can value life or happiness over truth. And many people do. And I think, George, you know what? We have a great divide among humanity. And I know this is an oversimplification because there's a lot of different people in the world, but I kind of split people into these two camps. I think there's a line. I think there really is a line, and some people are like, they do want to live in fantasy. They would rather believe in, certain belief systems, and just not question them if there's contradictions. Just believe a certain thing because it makes them happy to believe it, and ignore evidence. And then there might be another group of people who seek truth so much, and for them, truth is such an ideal that they seek the truth, and some of them are happy with that truth, and some of them are so depressed that they kill themselves. But in the end, I think people fall on one side or the other. I think people are valuing either happiness or truth more. One desire trumps the other. And you know what, Georgia, may even vary. In the lifetime of one person, at one stage in their life, they may care more about happiness, and at another stage, they may care more about truth at the expense of happiness, even. And we know it's not up to us. We can't blame ourselves for having one desire that overpowers another, which is a good point to remember.
Yeah. What's interesting about your perspective is that, like, it's coming from an atheist worldview. In other words, sometimes like people will connect truth with something that's deeply spiritual, something close to God. This kind of like a theistic conception of reality that serving God, whatever. But in a certain sense, I think, although not deistic in any sense, you kind of you give reality a similar kind of stature or importance. It's not theistic, but like, truth is extremely important. I think to you, truth is more important than, for example, let's say, than life, than any life at all. That, like, for there to be truth, and then I guess the question would be, what is the what's the underlying philosophy of that? If, for example, if um, if I think what you're saying is like a world lived with where everybody's going around lying wouldn't be worth the world. That, like, it would be better if the world didn't exist, and like just then truth existed, without life. So if I'm understanding you correctly in that, then what's the underlying philosophy behind that? That preferring truth to life, or animate existence.
Well, George, I think you hit on something that I hadn't thought of before. What it really amounts to is that I believe that in a world where everybody is lying to suit what they want to believe or what they want others to believe, that I find a world like that not worth living in. I guess that's it. I think I find that if we have a world where people are doing that, I find it so unacceptable that my very will to live is shattered.
Well, I can understand that. For example, sometimes I think that, with the cruelty to animals, that most people just accept without a second thought. Sometimes I think to myself, would it be actually kinder if the world didn't exist, just so that cruelty wouldn't exist? And then I guess like, when I um when I go to that kind of perspective, my underlying belief, because I guess it has to be a belief, is that like that our lives aren't constrained to this biological carnate existence. That that we have a part of us. The atoms in our body are kind of like they've always been there. They've been there since the Big Bang and all, or whatever. That our this quote unquote life would continue. But yeah, if I was asked then, like, well, let's say we knew that, like, the world would, let's say if the world ended, there would be nothing, whatever, and no other worlds, then that becomes a different question. There's a statement to the effect that sometimes, like, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Sometimes when we kind of like adhere to this desire for perfection. And for example, we human beings are not perfect. Our lives aren't perfect, and some of us would kind of like say, well, if it's not perfect, then it's not worth it. It's kind of like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, in a sense that, like, if it's not perfect, it's not good. And I'm not sure that considering that we're living in a world that's so imperfect in so many ways, of which our lying is just one of them, because there are so many other kinds of you know sins, just like moral transgressions that we do. Um, it's like, yeah, the question is like, do we serve this perfect ideology, or is it wiser and maybe better to understand that certain things are wrong, but that rather than destroying what is because it's not perfect, to keep working on perfecting it. Like, if you have something, a pot that's not completely perfect, I mean, do you live with it and use it, or you destroy it trying to create a more perfect pot?
Yeah, I think the point is that if we find that something's not perfect, and because of that we just get too upset and give up, then we never make any improvements. And I guess it's not so much about, I mean, we may, well, not, we're not going to reach perfection because perfection is such an out there infit. There's always something better. So I don't think we'll ever reach perfect, but it's about improving from where we're at the time.
Exactly, yeah. Let's going back to this issue of truth. It's interesting because they've studied this, and for example, they've written books on lying, and people lie to themselves routinely, pretty much daily. Or either they lie or they have misconceptions of themselves. Sometimes, like, for example, people tend to evaluate themselves as better than average. That might be a mistaken conclusion, but it's these kinds of, like, sometimes we lie to ourselves. We don't kind of like allow ourselves, like with the free will thing, to appreciate the force of the truth in order to serve this happiness. And yeah, I guess the main question remains, what is the best strategy? Um, and I guess, I think that, no, I don't know. I just, I guess personally, I believe that that happiness is the ideal. So naturally, some, for example, like, with the ends justifying the means, like, there are some questions like, well, if if, how about if the entire world could be really super happy, but 1 million people or 1,000 people would have to be tortured incessantly for that. In cases like that, I'm not sure I could accept that. That would seem really wrong. So, like, it's not like it's a completely logical cost benefit analysis kind of consideration.
Yeah.
But
George, here's an interesting thought because this is heavily free will related. See, been this problem because years before I got involved with you and the whole free will illusion stuff. I was debating people on abortion for the longest time. And see, here's one of the things that's interesting. Understanding that none of us are truly morally responsible, that nobody is responsible for what they do because it wasn't truly up to them in the real sense. We just see that they did it, and there may be legal responsibility, but nobody's the true first cause of what they do, which leads to some very interesting ideas and extreme implications for the abortion thing. On one hand, it completely obliterates all of the pro-life arguments that are hinged upon responsibility, that tell people, well, it's your responsibility to take care of this child, or at least to not kill it because you chose to bring it into existence by having sex. That is a common pro-life argument, but as you know now, I think it's completely wrong because we can never argue from moral responsibility. So that tends to be a bad. The bad news, in a sense, is that I can see how it may lead to more abortions, in a sense, this message of no free will. But at the same time, there are two things. First, as you know, I value truth and would not lie and tell people that they're responsible, even if it led to the results I wanted. But there is something else. It's not just about truth, there's also a happiness aspect of this, which you can appreciate. Because even if there were some bad consequences, whatever people are doing, whether it's abortion or whether it's the cruelty to animals or climate change, the bad things that people are doing, they also don't have to blame themselves once they understand the truth that it wasn't up to them. And I think that if it all plays back into the happiness, because if these people feel so bad from feeling morally responsible that destroys their life and makes their life not worth living, then we are in while we may be killing some lives through the message, we may be saving other lives.
Yeah, and it's always an equation. It's always like trying to predict what's going to create the greatest good, the greatest amount of good, or prevent the greatest amount of suffering. In politics, right now, I kind of like am torn. On the one hand, my experience with politics is that, like, as an individual, it's kind of like improbable that I can make much of a difference in whatever, even though I've tried for years and years. Um, and so, like, part of me says, well, let me pursue a different avenue. Let me try to, for example, work on my personal happiness as much as I can and see how much of a gain that I can make in that. And if I discover something in the process that's helpful to humanity, then perhaps I'll have helped humanity more than if I neglected my happiness work, in favor of this political work that doesn't seem to, like, bear such fruit. But again, the calculation is always like what we predict is going to lead to the best outcome. And I guess we just the free will question just shows us that because we're created differently, because we're raised differently, we just come up with different answers to that. Some person might think, well, no, like involving oneself in politics, even though it's very improbable, might seem to them more realistic, or more in the service of good, whatever. And so yeah, now again, like there probably is a right answer in terms of any of these kinds of like equation questions that we're asking. What's the right course? But in general, I think sometimes it's very obvious to us, but a lot of times, we can't know. A lot of times, it's so nebulous. will telling people, I think with the free will thing is actually quite obvious that when people understand that nobody has a free will, that it'll help us and all. But with other things, I think it's a bit less clear. Like what sometimes, for example, people will claim that being a martyr to the world is 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 really virtuous, but sometimes being a martyr to the world creates a lot of unhappiness, whereas sometimes people who are like actually very self-interested, perhaps even greedy or selfish, because of their selfishness, they ironically do some good things for the world. It's misguided and all, but so yeah, the equations do sometimes get confused, and like I guess the fundamental reality is that, like, we do, because we don't have a free will, we just like we we're compelled to have these different views, and we have to ask ourselves why that is. Why the universe is so inconsistent in that way. Why doesn't everyone think and feel the same way about things? But that is the reality. And again, it's a good question, because it is like it's at the foundation of what we do. We're doing our work on free will for the sake of happiness, and the matter of truth is again also, its importance is completely about happiness. So, like, it's a very important question to ask.
Yeah, I do think it's worth considering. And also, I want to second what you said there. It's hard for us to know, it's hard for us to calculate what will lead to the greatest happiness overall. And in fact, our co host Mitch J, in one of our personal opinion episodes about morality, he's talking about we can have no way of predicting what will lead to the greatest happiness. It's so there is a right answer, but we don't know what it is. And so, yeah, first of all, the best informed person can't always make the right decision. And second of all, we make different decisions based on our whole causal past, our genetics and our conditioning the whole time up to the current moment. So it's interesting, George, because I think that this has been a great episode because we've talked about, the importance of truth versus happiness. And I think that it's something I'll continue to consider. It's just that in recent days, I've been seriously considering that I value truth more than anything. It's just become my highest ideal. And but I also agree with something else is that while it's true that we don't have free will, the only reason I'm as motivated, to write about it and record podcasts about it, the reason I'm so, motivated to promote this message that we don't have free will and that we don't need to blame ourselves is once again due to happiness. So it all fits together. As long as we can have truth and happiness together, there is no conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because, like, you seem to be focused on truth now, and I think that's very appropriate, because basically we're like about 8 months away from a national election, a presidential election, and like there's candidates going across the country just lying through their teeth about pretty much everything. And so these are the times, this coming year, these coming 8 months or so, are it's extremely important to value truth, to champion truth. I mean, like, in politics in general, this is one case I think where, like, when people are misled, that leads to a lot of great harm, because our whole democracy is based on, like, that we're making our decisions based on on a truthful you know knowledge of the facts. So, for example, if the Republican Party is saying that climate change doesn't exist, and I can't believe they can be so ignorant, so unintelligent as to believe that. I truly believe they're lying. Then that's a serious lie, and like, maybe your reaction to your championing this of truth is a reaction to that our world is so steeped with untruth. Much more so, I think, societally, I think, than personally. I think personally, we kind of like will tell lies to defend ourselves and to defend others sometimes. But, politically, our world is just seeped with lies. And I think, championing the truth is extremely important, especially now.
Yeah, because I think in the end, I mean, people do respect someone who tells the truth, even when they disagree with them. You know, for example, Trick Slattery, you know, his reasoning is quite valid, when he talks about antinatalism. I understand his viewpoint entirely. I understand the logic behind it. And sometimes he's so good at arguing for this case of, consequentially, that even aborting children already conceived leads to greater happiness and prevents them from future pain they'll experience. And honestly, sometimes I just don't know anymore. But it's sort of like I'm not going to dismiss the truth in what he's saying, even though I have feelings otherwise that completely disagree.
Yeah, with antinatalism, certainly it would prevent pain, but it would also prevent happiness. I mean, if people aren't alive, they're neither experiencing pleasure or pain. So,
Yeah, and you know what, George? I think this is one of these things where we can't know the right answer. We don't have access to the right information that would allow us to make the right decision. For example, we've got two things going on. The climate change is one thing, because here's the deal. If climate change gets so bad that we're all about to die really soon anyway, then you know what? The abortion question is rather inconsequential if that's the case. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And also in context, I mean, like, humanity, like human beings have been around for, I guess the way we are now for what, 30,000 years? And like our species, like, just, we have like these ancestors like Lucy and all that have been around 3, 4 million years. And then compare that to our 13.8 billion, year, span of the universe. So I hope, like kind of like in defense of this anti-natalism view, or not in defense, but like to kind of like explain it. I hope that that our being alive in this form isn't all that important because, like, we will, we have basically experienced the exact opposite of it for many times more, much more, much longer a time, and eventually, for example, the sun will extinguish itself, and also like, so I guess I end up hoping that there will be like a different kind of reality that isn't necessarily life, but I guess part of me, like, I find it difficult to conceive of not existing. I think some people find that actually a pleasant prospect,
Well,
but I don't.
I'm glad you brought that up, George, because that was going to be my second point. Um, because now, were you still saying something? Because I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, no, it's all right. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, well, here's the deal. There's a certain sect of Christianity that believes that, well, when the aborted babies die, they go to heaven. Whereas if they were to live later on in their life in sin, then they would go to hell. And I mentioned this on my Facebook page, and I got a variety of strange comments, let me tell you. But Trick Slattery, he pointed out logically that it would be the moral thing in that situation to kill your children so that they experience an eternity of bliss, because that gives them an eternity of happiness under that belief system. And so, George, here's the deal is that even the question of morality of killing someone or not, if it could be demonstrated that there was an afterlife, which I currently don't believe at this point for many reasons, but if it could be demonstrated that we still live after we die, then here's what it means is that when we die, we do not in fact die because we still live.
No, I know. It becomes very, very complicated. That's like, that's, within Christianity, I think Judaism perhaps also like, yeah, their belief, they believe in a heaven and hell, and they believe that like the age of accountability is at like 5 or 8 or whatever age it is, and that before that, the children, the infants automatically go to heaven. So it creates an extreme moral dilemma. It would seem like that the most selfless love for a child would be to abort them or kill them before they reach that age. But naturally, there's a part of us that kind of like just considers that so wrong.
Yeah, and it's
So
interesting, George, because this is what I meant when I was saying I was having an existential crisis or whatever. Because it is very interesting, because if you throw the idea of an afterlife into the mix, a person could still find something wrong with the idea of killing because of the pain that often goes into killing someone. But if they do not, in fact, die because they live on in another life, then you know what that would lead to? That would lead to the fact that death is an illusion just as much as free will.
well, yeah, I mean, like, I hope that is the case. I hope that again that we have this kind of like incorporeal soul. It's spiritual. That like maybe it may be physical, but we can't detect it with our technology, and that we've always existed, will always exist. I think that's and ideally, like for example, in terms of pain, because I think the only thing we object to in this reality is suffering and pain. And I think our understanding is that like pain evolved about 300 million years ago with the decapods, like lobsters and crabs. Before they evolved, apparently organisms didn't have the biology to experience pain. So hopefully, yeah, hopefully the rest of eternity can, be in a state that's not in pain, but just like continue to exist, and ideally in a kind of a bliss.
Yeah, and here's what's interesting about it, George, is one thing that's very important is that while I'm open to the idea that there might be an afterlife theory or some kind of conception of an afterlife, which I've never considered, it's just that all of those types of afterlife beliefs that are commonly believed in this world are connected to Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or some form of well-established religion that has official teachings that what you choose of your free will determines your afterlife. And so here's the deal, George. While we may currently have different beliefs about regarding an afterlife, we know that we have zero choice in what afterlife we end up with.
Well, that's true. That's true.
And I think, George, what's interesting about this is that this truth that we don't have a free will, even though I'm quite shaken up right now, I'm quite shaken up and emotional because of realizing that I am not so sure at this point whether I can even make the case that killing is wrong without this extra knowledge of what happens after we die or about future suffering or so I'm really shaken up about that, you might be able to tell. But it does help knowing that it's not my fault if I am wrong. If I do make the wrong decision about something, I can't blame myself. And I think that is what helps the most. Because if we believe that it is up to us with our limited knowledge to do what's right in issues of life and death, we're going to feel this immense pressure that's just too much.
I hear you. I hear you. All right. I think we're going on to an hour, but this has been excellent. I mean, like, again, the issue of truth, the issue of truth is at the foundation of our work about free will. So it's an extremely important matter. And, as we've discovered, it's not a very, simple, it's complicated. There are different layers of this, but I think it's something that the more we explore it, the more comprehensively we understand it.
Yes, I agree. And in future episodes, I'm sure that our co host will want to weigh in on what we've talked about today about this complex interaction of happiness versus truth. And we believe that we're doing both. So there's not really much of a conflict right now about free will with happiness or truth, but it does play into some of our other moral dilemmas that we may be having in our own lives. But yes, this was a great talk, and so I'm going to end this episode, and we'll have more great talks in the future on this. You've been listening to Free Will, Science, and Religion with Chandler Klebs and George Ortega, and we've been talking about the complex interaction and competition, even sometimes, between doing things based on what leads to the greatest happiness or living according to what we believe is the truth. Whether truth or happiness is the highest ideal. And while we're not sure about this, I think we can agree that both happiness and truth are very important values for most people in this world. And so it's a good question to consider, and we'll consider this and more topics in future episodes. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.